This deep dive, this one takes us into some pretty murky waters.
Murky water.
Yeah, the kind of place where faith and mental health,
Yeah,
they collide.
a real collision.
Yeah, in a really unsettling way. We're going to be exploring the case of Joan Vulmer,
Joan Vulmer.
an Australian woman who died during an exorcism
During an exorcism?
in 1993.
1893, wow.
Our source material for this deep dive comes from a true crime podcast that just goes into some pretty chilling details about this whole case. Are you ready to kind of unpack this one with me?
Absolutely. I think this is one of those cases that really forces you to grapple with some really, really tough questions about belief and responsibility.
Yeah.
And really the limits of human understanding.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm ready.
Okay, let's do it. So we're gonna start the story in rural Australia, and we're talking tiny isolated town called Antwerp.
Antwerp.
This is where Joan and Ralph Vulmer lived on a pig farm, like a world away from, the spotlight that would soon kind of engulf their lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the isolation is really important here.
Yeah.
Because it really does kind of intensify the challenges of mental illness, but it also really limits access to resources and support.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that Joan, she had a history of mental illness. She struggled with things like schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression, really serious conditions
Oh, yes, serious.
that require care and understanding. And it seems that she had received medical care. She had even been hospitalized, a few years before this.
Okay.
Now imagine living with these challenges,
Yeah.
right? The internal struggles, the ups and downs in such an isolated environment.
Yeah, that isolation, like we said, can really, really make things so much worse.
And we're learning about the story largely through Ralph's perspective.
Ralph, yeah.
And it's clear that he was, a deeply devout man
Devout.
who believed in the power of faith to heal.
Okay.
So how did this devoutness, play a role in Joan's care?
Well, I think that instead of solely relying on, the traditional medical treatments,
Yeah.
Ralph, he started viewing Joan's illness through, the lens of his faith.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads him down a path with some devastating consequences.
Yeah, so this path, it takes a sharp turn after they both attended a charismatic Christian convention in Adelaide.
Adelaide. All right.
And after that, Ralph reported that Joan's symptoms, they just worsened.
They got worse. Okay.
Yeah, he described her as becoming more restless, making these unusual noises, and even seeming to adopt, different personalities.
Different personalities. So that's where this narrative really starts to get complex because we're kind of seeing Joan's behavior
Right.
through the lens of Ralph's belief system.
Yeah.
What he interprets as, these signs of demonic possession
Uh-huh.
could very well have been manifestations of her existing mental illnesses.
Absolutely.
We see that a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to, tease those two apart sometimes.
It is. It is.
So how did this interpretation lead to the decision to perform an exorcism on Joan?
Well, that's where John and Leanne Reichenbach come in,
Okay.
a charismatic couple known for performing deliverances.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually something I was curious about. Like, what's the difference? What's the difference between a deliverance and an exorcism?
That's a great question, and it is an important distinction to make.
Okay.
While both of these practices, they aim to expel evil spirits.
Okay.
A deliverance is typically thought of as less formal
Okay.
and less ritualistic, than a full-blown exorcism,
Okay.
which, just so you know, is usually conducted by a priest within the Catholic Church.
Gotcha.
And deliverance ministries, they often operate outside of established religious institutions
Oh, I see.
and may kind of employ, a wider range of techniques.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And the Reichbachs, they had a significant influence on Ralph, didn't they?
They did, yeah. They really reinforced his belief that Joan was possessed by demons, and they encouraged him to, pursue a spiritual solution over, medical intervention.
So the stage is set for this tragic clash between faith and mental health.
Yeah.
We have this group of people driven by their beliefs gathered in this isolated farmhouse
In that farm.
with the intention of casting out demons from Joan.
And it's important to remember this wasn't just like a quick prayer session, right?
Right.
This was a week-long ordeal where Joan was subjected to some really horrifying practices. They prayed over her, restrained her, deprived her of sleep, food, and water.
Oh my gosh, it's hard to even fathom the level of suffering
I
that
know.
she must have endured during those 7 days. This source material details some truly disturbing acts, like they tied her feet,
At her feet.
they slapped her, they even pried her eyes open. Like, it's just,
That's awful.
yeah. And it really raises a question for me about consent.
Consent, yeah.
Was Joan in her vulnerable mental state
Right.
truly capable of giving informed consent to this intense and prolonged intervention?
Yeah, or was she being coerced because of, her dependence on
Yeah.
the people around her?
Makes you wonder.
It does.
And it seems there were other individuals involved in this exorcism as well. We have Leah Klugston, Kathleen Newski, David Klingner, Matthew Newski,
Yeah.
each playing a role, some praying, some physically restraining Joan.
And, we have to remember, this group genuinely believed they were helping Joan.
Yeah.
They were battling for her soul.
Yeah.
They believed that she was possessed by multiple demons. They named them Legion and the baby Princess Joan. And, that conviction just completely blinded them to the human suffering that was unfolding right in front of them.
Tragically, Joan's condition continues to deteriorate until she ultimately
Right.
died during the exorcism. But here's the thing that I find even more chilling, is that the group, convinced she would be resurrected, they delayed calling the authorities. Think about that. Like, their belief was so absolute,
Yeah.
so deeply ingrained,
Ingrained.
it overshadowed the reality of death.
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah, and this delay speaks volumes about the power of these belief systems
Belief systems.
to shape our perceptions, our actions,
Yeah.
even in the face of undeniable evidence.
That's powerful, yeah.
So it makes you wonder, at what point does unwavering belief cross the line into dangerous delusion?
That's the question.
It is the question.
Yeah.
And how do we reconcile the right to religious freedom with the responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals?
Big questions.
Big, big questions. And those are questions that we're going to keep kind of circling back to
Keep them in mind.
as we continue our deep dive into this case. The death of Joan Vulmer wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a public spectacle that would spark outrage, legal battles, and just a societal reckoning with the limits of faith and the complexities of mental health.
So much to unpack.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so much to unpack. Stay with us as we explore the aftermath of this unsettling event and the lasting impact it had on those involved, the community, and just the ongoing conversation about faith, mental health, and the law.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
The circumstances surrounding Joan's death.
Yeah.
They immediately got the attention of the authorities, and the media frenzy that followed was intense.
I can imagine. It's such a shocking case.
Yes.
So people must have been horrified by what had happened in that isolated farmhouse.
Oh, absolutely. And amidst all of this public outcry,
Yeah.
there were these legal battles brewing. So to answer your question about the initial charges brought against those involved,
Yeah.
initially, 4 people were charged with manslaughter. We had Ralph Fulmer, Leanne Reichenbach,
Okay.
David Klinger, and Matthew Newski. They faced a committal hearing to determine if there was enough evidence
Right.
to proceed to a full trial.
Okay, so they were at least initially being held accountable for their role in Joan's death.
Exactly, yeah.
But I understand there was a bit of a twist in the legal proceedings, right?
Yeah, there was a pretty unexpected one.
Hey.
The magistrate presiding over the committal hearing,
Mm-hmm.
he decided to drop all the charges.
Wow, okay, so that must have been a controversial decision.
Oh, extremely controversial.
What was the reasoning behind dropping the charges?
Well, it really hinged on the autopsy report.
Okay.
The report, it did reveal that Joan had a fractured neck, but he determined there just wasn't enough evidence to directly link the pressure on her neck to the cardiac arrest that caused her death.
So a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing.
Yeah, they couldn't definitively say.
Yeah.
That's what it.
And I can only imagine, like you said, the public reaction to this decision.
Oh, the public was outraged.
Outright.
It felt like a complete miscarriage of justice.
Yeah.
Here was this group of people who had, subjected Joan to this horrific ordeal, all in the name of exorcism, and they were just walking free.
It doesn't seem right.
It didn't sit well with people.
Yeah, and that public pressure,
Yeah.
did it have a direct impact on the case?
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because fueled by that public outrage
Mm-hmm.
and a sense that justice hadn't been served, the director of public prosecutions,
Okay.
he did something pretty bold. He reinstated the manslaughter charges
Oh, wow.
against Ralph, Leanne, David, and Matthew.
So a year after Joan's death,
A year later,
they found themselves back in court,
back in court,
this time facing a jury.
facing a jury, that's right.
And this trial, I mean, from what I've read, it was just captivating. Just this
Captivating.
mix of faith and legal strategy and the quest for justice.
You're absolutely right. And the prosecution's approach, I
Yeah.
found it fascinating.
Okay.
They didn't, just dismiss the defendant's beliefs as irrational or
Right.
fanatical. They decided to tackle them head on.
Head on.
Yeah. They brought in religious experts
Okay.
to testify.
So they were meeting faith with faith, like using religious knowledge to challenge the defense's claims.
Exactly. And these expert witnesses, they basically argued that what the four defendants had done,
Yeah.
it bore no resemblance to genuine exorcism
Right.
as practiced by mainstream Christianity.
Yeah.
They pointed out that real exorcisms
Right.
were rare,
Okay.
and they typically just involved prayer and maybe the laying on of hands, but never that kind of violence
Right. Right.
that was inflicted upon Joan.
So it sounds like they were trying to dismantle the defense's claim
They were dismantling it.
that their actions were, simply a manifestation of their religious beliefs.
Absolutely. And the prosecution, they presented a really multifaceted case. They called upon Joan's brother-in-law, Neville, who actually testified about Ralph's account of Joan's death.
Okay.
Apparently, Ralph had mentioned that Joan died slowly,
Okay.
but curiously, he left out any mention of the exorcism.
Ah, interesting. So they were highlighting inconsistencies
Inconsistent.
in Ralph's narrative
Exactly, yeah.
to poke some holes in it.
To poke some holes, that's right.
And they also brought in a psychiatrist?
Yes, a psychiatrist
Mm-hmm.
who had treated Joan back in 1990.
90, okay.
He provided some crucial insights into her mental health history,
Okay.
which I think really bolstered their argument that Joan's behavior was rooted in mental illness
Yeah.
and not demonic possession.
Right. And then to further solidify their case, they brought in a senior Catholic official.
They did, and this was a really strategic move
Okay.
because this official, he testified about the evolving understanding of exorcisms within the Catholic Church.
Oh, interesting.
And he explained how exorcisms had become much less common
Okay.
with the rise of mental health awareness
I see.
and understand. So the prosecution was really weaving together medical expertise, religious perspectives,
Yeah.
and personal testimonies to paint this picture for the jury.
Right. So they had a strong case.
They did.
But what about the defense? What was their strategy? How did they counter all of these arguments?
Well, the defense focused on a few key arguments. First, they maintained that Joan had consented to the exorcism.
Okay.
But this claim was, shaky at best,
Yeah.
given Joan's, fragile mental state.
Right. And the coercive nature of the situation.
Exactly. And they also argued that their belief in demonic possession, it was reasonable, citing biblical references to kind of back up their claim.
But did they acknowledge that their actions, regardless of their beliefs, ultimately led to Joan's death?
Not directly, no. They tried to introduce alternative explanations for her death,
Okay.
like suggesting that she might have died from an asthma attack or an epileptic fit.
But wasn't there a pathologist, like a medical expert?
There was the pathologist who performed the autopsy. He just couldn't definitively determine the cause of the cardiac arrest.
So they were trying to just plant that seed of doubt
Planting the seed, yeah,
in the jurors' minds.
exactly.
And it's interesting that none of the defendants took the stand themselves.
They didn't.
Right.
That's right. They chose not to testify.
Leanne's husband did.
He did. John Reckenbach did take the stand.
Okay.
He testified that, he believed Joan was possessed by multiple spirits
Uh-huh.
and described her behavior during the exorcism as, like, proof
Yeah.
of this possession. He even claimed that Joan revealed information about the exorcists
Oh, wow.
that she couldn't have possibly known, so,
Which they took as further confirmation.
further confirmation of possession, yeah.
So even in the face of all this evidence and these expert testimonies, they were really clinging to their belief system.
They're clinging tight.
And it seems like a classic clash between faith and reason.
It really is.
A struggle between deeply held convictions
Yeah.
and, the objective reality
Yeah.
presented in a court of law.
Yeah.
And it was up to the jury
Up to the jury.
to weigh the evidence, consider the arguments, and ultimately decide the fate of those involved.
Such a heavy burden.
So what was the verdict? I mean, were they swayed by the prosecution's arguments, or did the defense manage to raise enough reasonable doubt?
That's the big question. It was a tough one. Yeah.
It was. So what did the jury decide?
Well, after weeks of testimony, a whole day of deliberation, The jury returned with the verdicts.
Okay.
Leanne Reichenbach and David Klinger, they were found guilty of manslaughter and false imprisonment.
So they were held directly responsible
Directly
for
responsible.
Joan's death. What about Ralph Vulmer and Matthew Niski?
Ralph, he was found not guilty of manslaughter,
Okay.
but was convicted on those lesser charges of recklessly causing serious injury and false imprisonment.
Okay.
And Matthew Niski, remember he was the youngest of the group, called in later to the exorcism.
Right.
He was acquitted of manslaughter,
Okay.
but found guilty of false imprisonment.
So it seems like the jury, they consider the roles and actions of each individual involved.
Did, yeah.
What happened during the sentencing?
Well, the judge, he was really clear in his statements.
Okay.
He emphasized that they weren't being punished for performing an exorcism,
Okay.
but rather for the excessive force and cruelty they inflicted upon Joan.
Yeah.
He said that, he acknowledged their belief that they were acting in Joan's best interest,
Right.
but stressed that the law does not permit such brutality, even under the guise of religious practice.
Yeah.
He actually called their actions bizarre, extraordinary, and cruel.
Wow. Pretty strong words.
Yeah, they were.
Coming from a judge.
Yeah, so it's like he was recognizing their beliefs, but at the same time condemning their actions.
What sentences did they actually receive?
Well, Leanne Reifenbach, she received a sentence of 2 years,
Okay.
and David Kleiner received 18 months. However, a significant portion of both of their sentences was suspended.
Okay.
Ralph Vulmer, he got a 12-month sentence,
Uh-huh.
all of which was suspended.
Okay.
And Matthew Niski was given a 3-month suspended sentence.
So only Leanne and David actually served time in prison.
That's right.
Wow. And they appealed the verdict, right?
It did.
Saying that Joan consented and that she posed a danger to herself.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the convictions.
It's just, I can't imagine what Joan's family went through during this entire ordeal.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. It is. Did they ever speak publicly?
They chose to remain mostly out of the public eye.
Understandable.
Yeah, but they did speak briefly after the sentencing,
Okay.
just expressing their profound grief or hoping for closure.
And what about the community?
The community of Antwerp.
Yeah. How did this case impact them?
Well, in this case, it had huge impact on the community. It really shook people to their core. Even those who shared the defendants' religious beliefs were disturbed by what had happened.
Yeah, the level of extremism.
The extremism, the violence.
Yeah, it's scary.
And it sparked a lot of debates, about religious extremism, the vulnerability of people with mental illness, and the responsibility of society to protect those who are most at risk.
It's a case that, though it happened decades ago, it still resonates today.
Absolutely.
It serves as a reminder of the potential for harm when belief systems collide with the complexities of human experience.
It's just being human.
Yeah, and particularly when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It raises those uncomfortable questions about how we as a society navigate the boundaries between, personal beliefs and the well-being of others.
Tough questions.
Tough questions. How do we ensure that individual freedoms don't come at the expense of those who are most vulnerable?
Yeah, we have to protect the vulnerable.
We do. And these are questions that we need to keep discussing and keep debating.
Keep talking about.
Because the stakes are high.
They are.
Joan Vulmer's story is a tragic testament. To the consequences of unchecked extremism. And a reminder of the importance of compassion and understanding and a commitment to protecting those in need.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been, a challenging exploration.
It has.
But one that, hopefully has left you with some insights and some lingering questions.
Some things to think about.
Yeah. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.